Many people come to prayer not in peace but in panic. They approach the moment of prayer as a last defense against life, as though God were distant and needed convincing. In that state, prayer becomes an intense focus on the very condition one wants removed. The mind repeats the story of the illness, the fear, the lack, the broken relationship, and unknowingly gives it more life. What is held in consciousness is what multiplies. When prayer is driven by fear, it does not lift consciousness above the problem. It anchors it more deeply within it. When someone prays to change a situation, the unspoken assumption is that something is wrong and must be fixed. This assumption itself becomes the barrier. Prayer then turns into an effort of the human mind trying to manipulate spiritual law. The more force that is applied, the more resistance is felt. This is why many people feel exhausted after praying. They were not communing with the divine, they were struggling with their own thoughts, trying to make something happen through willpower. There is a subtle ego hidden in desperate prayer. It says, "I know what should happen, and I need help making it happen." In this state, the individual remains at the center, directing the process. The problem does not dissolve because the one praying has not stepped out of the way. True spiritual power is not released through effort but through surrender. As long as prayer is used as a tool to control outcomes, it strengthens the sense of separation between the one praying and the source of life. Real prayer begins when words fall away. It is not asking for peace, it is resting in peace. It is not pleading for guidance. It is becoming still enough to recognize that guidance is already present. When the mind stops rehearsing the problem, awareness shifts. In that shift, the problem loses its authority. It may still appear in form, but it no longer governs the inner state. This is where transformation begins, quietly and without force. Many are surprised to discover that relief comes not when the problem changes, but when their relationship to it changes. The moment one stops fighting reality, an inner alignment occurs. In that alignment, clarity replaces confusion and right action unfolds naturally. The struggle ends not because the situation was defeated, but because it was no longer believed to have power over life itself. The shocking truth is that prayer worsens problems only when it is used to affirm fear, separation, and personal control. When prayer becomes a silent yielding to what already is, the burden lifts. In that yielding, one discovers that the presence they were seeking was never absent. What dissolves the problem is not effort, but awareness. What heals is not pleading, but listening. And in that listening, life reveals itself as whole, complete, and untouched by the storms of the human mind. When prayer begins in fear, it unknowingly gives authority to the very condition it hopes to remove. Fear is not neutral, it is a state of consciousness that assumes danger, lack, or power outside oneself. When a person prays while feeling afraid, the mind is already convinced that something is wrong and threatening. Prayer then becomes a reaction rather than a realization. Instead of lifting awareness above appearances, it circles around them, reinforcing the belief that the problem is real, powerful, and capable of controlling life. Fear-based prayer constantly names, explains, and analyzes the difficulty. Each time the problem is described inwardly, it is impressed more deeply upon consciousness. Thought is creative, not because it changes outer forms instantly, but because it shapes perception. What is accepted as true in consciousness becomes the lens through which all experience is interpreted. When fear dominates prayer, the individual is not communing with truth, but rehearsing the appearance of error, giving it mental substance and emotional energy. In this state, prayer subtly becomes an act of resistance. The mind pushes against what is happening, declaring, "This should not be." Resistance does not dissolve conditions, it tightens them. The more one resists, the more attention is fixed on the object of resistance. Fear keeps awareness locked into time, projecting past disappointments and future consequences. Prayer that comes from this mental atmosphere cannot be still because fear demands constant movement, constant asking, constant reassurance. There is also a hidden contradiction in fearful prayer. It attempts to reach peace while affirming disturbance. It asks for harmony while inwardly confessing chaos. This inner division prevents the experience of spiritual assurance. Peace cannot be added to fear. Fear must be released for peace to be recognized. Until that release occurs, prayer feels strained and ineffective, leading many to believe that prayer itself has failed, when in truth it was never allowed to function as prayer. Fear assumes separation. It believes that help is distant, delayed, or conditional. From that belief, prayer becomes an effort to bridge a gap that does not actually exist. The individual feels alone with a problem, speaking words upward while remaining trapped inwardly. This sense of separation magnifies the problem because it removes awareness from the source of stability and places it entirely within human reasoning. As fear continues, the mind watches the problem closely, measuring whether prayer is working, scanning for signs of improvement or decline. This constant monitoring strengthens attachment to outcome. The problem becomes the central focus of consciousness, and prayer is reduced to a tool for survival rather than a recognition of truth. In this way, fear-driven prayer does not fail because it lacks sincerity, but because it affirms the reality of what it seeks to escape, keeping awareness bound to appearances rather than resting in the deeper assurance that dissolves them from within. When prayer is used as an attempt to change God, it begins from a misunderstanding of the nature of divine reality. It assumes that the source of life can be persuaded, influenced, or corrected. In this mindset, prayer becomes a form of negotiation, as though truth were undecided and waiting for human input. The moment this belief is accepted, attention shifts away from inner awareness and toward outer results. The focus is no longer on alignment but on alteration, no longer on understanding but on control. This kind of prayer silently declares that what is unfolding is outside of divine order. By asking for God to intervene, the mind affirms that harmony is absent in the present moment. The consciousness becomes occupied with the idea that something must be fixed before peace can be experienced. This postpones peace and places it in the future, dependent on conditions changing. As long as peace is conditional, it remains out of reach, because the inner state is tied to appearances rather than truth. Trying to change God through prayer also keeps the problem constantly in view. One must continually think about what needs to be corrected in order to ask for its correction. This repeated attention strengthens the mental image of the problem. The mind begins to measure divine response by visible outcomes, creating disappointment when things do not shift quickly or at all. This disappointment reinforces the belief that either prayer is ineffective or God is unresponsive, both of which deepen doubt and frustration. There is an underlying arrogance hidden in this approach, though it rarely feels that way to the one praying. It is the assumption that the human mind knows what outcome should occur and when it should occur. From this position, prayer becomes a demand for a specific form rather than an openness to deeper wisdom. When that form does not appear, resistance grows. The individual feels unheard, abandoned, or tested, all of which increase emotional tension and inner struggle. As this struggle continues, prayer becomes exhausting. Instead of renewing the spirit, it drains energy. Words multiply, urgency increases, and stillness disappears. The mind is busy explaining, reminding, and insisting. Yet in all of this activity, awareness never shifts. The person remains identified with the problem, believing that divine action must enter from outside rather than be recognized from within. True prayer does not seek to move God, it allows consciousness to be moved out of false assumptions. When prayer is misused as a tool to alter divine will, it reinforces the illusion that life is unpredictable and that harmony is fragile. The deeper truth remains unseen, not because it is withheld, but because attention is fixed on changing circumstances instead of yielding to the presence that already governs them, silently, completely, and without needing human direction. When personal effort dominates prayer, it quietly blocks spiritual awareness by keeping attention fixed on the door rather than on being. Effort assumes that something must be achieved, reached or produced through mental strain. In this state, prayer becomes work. The individual tries to generate faith, force belief, or hold the mind in a certain direction. This striving may feel sincere, but it keeps consciousness active on the surface level where spiritual perception cannot unfold naturally. Personal effort in prayer usually shows itself as mental control. Thoughts are pushed away, replaced, or rearranged in the hope of arriving at peace. The mind watches itself constantly, judging whether it is praying correctly or intensely enough. This self-monitoring prevents true stillness. Awareness never settles because effort is movement, and movement keeps the mind occupied with technique rather than presence. Instead of awareness expanding, it contracts around the one who is trying. There is also an underlying fear within effortful prayer, the fear that if one stops trying, something will be lost. This fear convinces the individual that vigilance is necessary, that prayer must be maintained through discipline and force. Yet spiritual awareness is not sustained by effort. It is recognized when effort ceases. As long as the mind believes it must hold reality together, it cannot perceive the intelligence already doing so. Effort creates tension in the body and mind. Shoulders tighten, breathing becomes shallow, and thoughts feel heavy. Prayer in this state does not refresh or clarify, it fatigues. The individual may leave prayer feeling burdened, questioning why peace did not arrive. The tension itself becomes evidence in their mind that something is wrong or that they failed. This reinforces the belief that prayer requires mastery rather than receptivity. When personal effort leads prayer, the sense of a separate self is strengthened. There is a clear me who is praying and a distant goal to be reached. This separation is the very illusion that spiritual awareness dissolves. By trying to reach truth, the mind unknowingly places truth outside of present awareness. The harder it tries, the further away truth seems, not because it has moved, but because effort creates the illusion of distance. Spiritual awareness unfolds in simplicity. It does not respond to force or willpower. It reveals itself when the mind relaxes its grip on outcomes and methods. Effort obscures this revelation by filling inner space with activity. Silence cannot be entered through motion, it is noticed when motion stops. When prayer shifts from doing to allowing, awareness widens without struggle. What was being sought through effort is discovered as already present, waiting not for discipline, but for surrender of the one who believed effort was required. When prayer is understood as listening rather than asking, its entire nature changes from effort to awareness. Asking assumes lack. It begins with the belief that something essential is missing and must be obtained. In that belief, the mind positions itself as separate from what it seeks. Listening, however, begins with a different assumption that truth, guidance, and presence already exist and can be recognized. This shift removes strain from prayer and replaces it with attentiveness. Asking keeps the mind active and outwardly focused. Words form, requests repeat, explanations multiply. The mind stays busy presenting problems, hoping for answers in return. In this activity, there is little space for insight to emerge. Listening requires stillness. It does not demand silence of sound, but silence of mental argument. When the inner dialogue slows, awareness becomes receptive rather than directive, allowing deeper perception to arise naturally. True listening in prayer is not waiting for a voice or a message. It is a quiet openness, free from expectation. Expectation itself is a form of asking because it anticipates a specific outcome. Listening releases the need to control what appears. It rests in the present moment without insisting that it change. In that resting, understanding unfolds without effort, often as clarity rather than words. When prayer becomes listening, the problem no longer dominates attention. Instead of rehearsing difficulties, awareness turns toward inner alignment. The mind stops insisting on answers and becomes willing to be shown what is already true. This willingness softens resistance. The heart opens without force. In that openness, fear loses its grip because it is sustained only by constant mental reinforcement. Listening also dissolves urgency. Asking is usually urgent because it is driven by discomfort. Listening is patient because it trusts that nothing essential is absent. This patience is not passive, it is alert and alive. It recognizes that wisdom does not arrive through pressure. Pressure closes perception, ease expands it. When urgency fades, intuition becomes clearer, and right action reveals itself quietly. Many struggle with listening because it feels like doing nothing. The mind equates value with activity. Yet the most profound shifts occur when activity ceases. In listening, the sense of a separate self gradually loosens. There is less identification with thoughts and emotions. Awareness begins to observe rather than react. This observation itself brings transformation, because what is clearly seen without judgment loses its power to dominate. Listening prayer also removes the burden of responsibility from the individual. Asking often carries the weight of making something happen. Listening releases that burden. It acknowledges an intelligence beyond personal thought. This acknowledgement is not blind faith, it is a recognition felt inwardly as steadiness. Guidance emerges not as instruction imposed from outside, but as a natural sense of rightness arising from within awareness itself. When prayer is listening, answers are not forced into form. They may appear as insight, timing, restraint, or unexpected peace. The mind no longer measures prayer by outcomes but by alignment. In that alignment, life flows with less resistance and understanding deepens without struggle, revealing that what was being asked for was never separate from the one who learned to listen. Resistance to reality creates inner conflict because it places the mind in opposition to what is actually being experienced. When a person resists a situation, emotion, or condition, the mind declares that the present moment is unacceptable. This rejection immediately divides awareness into two parts: what is happening and what should be happening. That division becomes the source of tension. The conflict does not arise from the circumstance itself, but from the refusal to allow it to be seen without judgment. Resistance feeds on mental commentary. The mind argues with reality by replaying thoughts, such as "this should not be happening," "this must change," or "this is unfair." These thoughts keep awareness locked into struggle. Instead of observing the moment clearly, the mind fights it. This fight consumes energy and creates emotional pressure, which is then mistaken for evidence that the situation is unbearable. In truth, it is the resistance that is unbearable, not the experience. When reality is resisted, the mind clings to an imagined alternative. That imagined state becomes a source of constant comparison. The present moment is measured against an idealized version of how things ought to be. Each comparison reinforces dissatisfaction. Peace becomes conditional, postponed until reality conforms to expectation. As long as peace is conditional, it cannot be felt because conditions are always shifting. Resistance also intensifies identification with the personal self. The thought, "I should not be experiencing this," strengthens the sense of a separate me, who is being attacked by life. This identification magnifies fear and defensiveness. The mind becomes alert to threat, scanning for ways to escape or control the situation. In this heightened state, clarity disappears. Actions taken from resistance are reactive, not intelligent, often worsening the very conditions one is trying to escape. There is also a subtle fear beneath resistance, the fear that acceptance means defeat. The mind believes that if it stops resisting, the situation will become permanent. This belief keeps the struggle alive. Yet acceptance is not agreement, and it is not passivity. Acceptance is simply the willingness to see clearly what is present without adding mental opposition. Clarity does not freeze conditions, it allows movement to occur without distortion. Inner conflict persists because resistance keeps the nervous system activated. The body responds to mental opposition as though it were physical danger. Muscles tense, breathing tightens, and thought patterns loop compulsively. This physiological response reinforces emotional distress, creating a cycle that feels inescapable. The individual then believes the situation itself is the cause of suffering, unaware that the struggle is internally generated. When resistance softens, something unexpected happens. The mind becomes quieter, not because the situation has changed, but because it is no longer being argued with. In that quietness, perception widens. Solutions, insights, or next steps become visible without force. Even if circumstances remain the same for a time, the inner weight lifts. Energy once spent on fighting is freed for understanding and appropriate response. Reality does not demand approval, it only requires recognition. The moment reality is met without resistance, inner conflict dissolves. What remains is a clear awareness capable of responding rather than reacting. In that clarity, peace is not dependent on conditions because it no longer argues with what is, allowing life to move without the friction of constant inner opposition. Surrender dissolves the sense of separation by removing the belief that life must be managed, controlled, or defended by a personal self. Separation is not an actual distance from truth, but a mental posture that assumes an isolated, facing an external world. This posture is sustained by constant effort to hold things together. Surrender interrupts that effort. It is not collapse or resignation, but the release of the belief that one stands apart from the flow of life. The sense of separation is maintained through continual inner narration. The mind labels experiences as happening to me, against me, or because of me. These labels reinforce identity as a door struggling within circumstances. Surrender allows these labels to fall away. Awareness shifts from being the one inside the experience to being the space in which the experience appears. This shift is subtle but profound. When it occurs, the feeling of being cut off from support dissolves naturally. Many resist surrender because it is mistaken for weakness. The personal self fears that without control, chaos will follow. Yet it is the attempt to control that creates tension. Surrender does not remove intelligence, it removes interference. When interference ends, intelligence expresses itself more clearly. Actions arise without strain, decisions feel simpler, and life no longer feels like a series of battles to be won. Separation also thrives on time. The mind believes fulfillment lies ahead and safety lies behind. Surrender brings attention fully into the present moment. In the present, the imagined gap between self and life cannot be sustained. There is only what is happening now and awareness of it. In this immediacy, the feeling of isolation weakens because connection is experienced directly, not thought about. As surrender deepens, trust replaces fear. This trust is not belief in a favorable outcome, but confidence in the underlying order of life. With trust, the need to constantly check, adjust, and worry fades. The mind stops positioning itself as the center of the universe. It relaxes into participation rather than control. In that relaxation, the sense of standing alone disappears. Surrender also transforms prayer. Instead of speaking from separation toward a distant source, prayer becomes silent recognition. There is no longer a one here reaching for something there. The reaching ends. What remains is awareness itself, calm and inclusive. This awareness does not argue with life or demand explanations. It simply knows without words that it is held. When surrender is genuine, the emotional body responds immediately. Breathing deepens, muscles soften, and the nervous system settles. These changes are not produced intentionally. They happen as a result of releasing resistance. The body mirrors the mind's return to wholeness. In this state, intuition becomes clearer because it is no longer drowned out by fear-based thinking. Separation dissolves not through understanding concepts, but through letting go of the one who believed separation was real. Surrender removes the center from which struggle was generated. What remains is a sense of belonging that does not depend on conditions. Life is no longer something to face, it is something being lived from within. In this living, the illusion of separation fades, revealing a quiet unity that was always present beneath effort, fear, and control. The deeper understanding behind all of this is that prayer does not fail because it lacks sincerity, effort, or repetition, but because it is often approached from fear, control, and separation. When prayer is used to fight reality, to change God, or to force outcomes, it strengthens the very sense of struggle it seeks to escape. Problems appear to grow not because prayer has no power, but because attention remains fixed on appearances while inner awareness remains unchanged. True prayer is a shift in consciousness, not a transaction. It begins when fear loosens, effort stops, and resistance softens. In that stillness, listening replaces asking, surrender replaces control, and awareness replaces struggle. The problem loses its dominance not through force, but through clarity. What once seemed heavy is seen without distortion, and what is seen clearly no longer binds the mind. When separation dissolves, prayer is no longer something done in moments of crisis, it becomes a way of being. Life is no longer approached as an enemy to be persuaded or corrected, but as an expression of an intelligence already present. From this understanding, peace is not something requested from the future, but something recognized now. In that recognition, the illusion of worsening problems fades, and what remains is a quiet assurance that nothing real is ever out of harmony, even when the mind once believed otherwise.